The first thing my mother-in-law ever said to me inside my own home before she even took her boots off was that the kitchen looked like a place a student rented. It was 7:40 on a Tuesday in February. The snow still half melted off her heels onto the floor I'd mopped at midnight, and I was standing there in my husband's old hoodie holding a baby who hadn't slept past 4. I remember thinking she must have meant it as a joke. She didn't smile. She put her purse on my counter, ran one finger along the edge of the stove, looked at the finger, and exhaled through her nose like she'd confirmed something she already suspected. My name is Sloane. I'm 31. I work from a corner of our spare bedroom doing freelance design for 2 agencies in Toronto. And for about a year and a half, I let a woman walk into my house whenever she felt like it because I was too tired and too polite and too in love with her son to say the word that would have ended it. The word was no. It took me 18 months and a snowstorm and a folder of evidence to finally say it, and I want to tell you exactly how it happened because if you're living some version of this right now, I want you to know there's a version of the story where you win. We bought the house in Burlington 2 years ago, a little 1970s side split off Walker's Line, the kind of place that needed everything done to it and that we could only barely afford after my husband's parents put in part of the down payment. That part matters. I didn't understand at the time how much it would matter. When someone helps you buy the roof over your head, they start to believe a corner of that roof belongs to them. And my mother-in-law believed it the way other people believe in gravity. She had a key from the first week. My husband gave it to her without asking me, the same way he'd given her the garage code, the same way he'd given her every benefit of every doubt his whole life. She just likes to feel useful, Sloane, he'd say. That's just how she is. That phrase, "that's just how she is," became the background hum of my marriage, the thing he said instead of standing up. She'd let herself into water plants I didn't own. She'd reorganized my pantry so I couldn't find the rice. She left sticky notes on the inside of cupboard doors, little blue squares in her tidy cursive. We wiped these down weekly. Expired check dates. A home runs on systems. I peeled them off and threw them out and told myself she meant well, because that's what you tell yourself when the alternative is a fight you don't think you can win. It got worse after Owen was born. I was on EI parental benefits, the math of which I'd worked out to the dollar at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning. 55% of my income capped at a number that didn't stretch the way you'd hope, and my husband was commuting into the city 4 days a week and traveling for work the 5th. So I was alone a lot, alone with a newborn in a half-renovated house in the dead gray middle of a Halton winter, and my mother-in-law decided that meant I needed supervision. She started coming over more. She'd just be passing by, though she lived 25 minutes away in Oakville and nothing she ever needed was on our side of the QEW. She'd arrive at 8 in the morning and find me still in pajamas because I'd been up all night, and she'd look at me the way you'd look at a stain. Once she picked up a onesie from the laundry basket, held it to the light, and asked if I'd considered that the baby might be reacting to an unhygienic environment. Owen had baby acne. Every baby gets it. But she said it in that soft, worried voice, the maternal one. And the worst part of that voice is that it makes you sound unhinged if you snap back. I want to be honest about something, because I promised myself I'd tell this straight. For a long time, I thought the problem was me. I thought maybe I was sensitive. Maybe I was the difficult one. Maybe a better wife would have laughed it off. I'd lie awake replaying her comments, trying to figure out which ones were real and which ones I'd imagined being cruel. That's the thing nobody tells you about this kind of person. They don't break your arm. They wear a groove into your confidence so slowly you don't notice you stop trusting yourself. The first time I realized it wasn't in my head was a Sunday in April. We were at her place in Oakville for dinner. She insisted on hosting every Sunday, white tablecloth, the good Royal Dalton, the whole performance, and she leaned across the table to my husband and said, "Elliot, sweetheart, have you given any more thought to getting Sloane some help? She just seems so overwhelmed lately." And my husband, my own husband, paused. He didn't say she's not overwhelmed. He didn't say she's doing great. He put down his fork and said, "I mean, if you're stressed, Sloane, we could talk about it. If you're stressed, Sloane, we could talk about it. If you're stressed," like it was a fact, already established by a higher authority, and I was just being asked to confirm. I wasn't overwhelmed. I was running a freelance business off 4 hours of sleep while raising an infant in a house with one functioning bathroom. And I was doing it well, but I sat at that table and felt the floor tilt because I understood for the first time that there were conversations about me happening in rooms I wasn't in and that my mother-in-law was the one running them. It turned out she'd been texting him. I found this out by accident, the way you always find out the thing that breaks you, looking over his shoulder while he scrolled. Photos. Photos of my house. A laundry basket on the stairs. 2 mugs in the sink. Owen's toys scattered on the living room rug, which is what toys do. That's the entire function of toys. Time-stamped, dozens of them going back weeks. And little captions. Just thinking of you both. Worried about the baby's environment. Does she seem okay to you? She'd been in my house taking pictures of my life and sending them to my husband to build something. I didn't have the word for what yet. I just knew that when I saw those photos, every hair on my arm stood up. Because a person doesn't document like that out of love. You document like that when you're getting ready to use it. I confronted my husband that night, and this is the part I'd change about the original me if I could. Except I can't. So I'll just tell you what happened. I didn't yell. I should have. I sat on the edge of our bed and I said, "Your mother is photographing our house and sending it to you, and you've been looking at the photos and saying nothing to me. I need you to tell me, right now, whose side you're on." And he gave me the, "That's just how she is." He gave me, "She means well." He gave me, "Don't make this a whole thing." So I made it a whole thing, quietly. I said, "If you can't stand between me and your mother, then I'm gonna start standing there myself, and you're not going to like how I do it." He thought I was being dramatic. He rolled over, and I lay there in the dark of our half-finished bedroom, listening to him fall asleep, and somewhere in that long flat hour, I stopped being afraid of her. Not because I felt brave, because I finally understood that being polite had never once protected me. It had only ever protected her. The humiliation, when it came at my own dining table in my own house, in front of my husband's entire family. She'd talked us into hosting a family lunch, she called it. The first big one since the Renos were mostly done, and somehow it became 14 people. My husband's brother and his wife, 2 aunts, a cousin, the cousin's kids, a great uncle who fell asleep before dessert. I cooked for 2 days. I'm not a natural cook, and I knew every dish would be inspected, so I tried too hard. A glazed ham and scalloped potatoes and a salad nobody touched, and a trifle I stayed up until 1 in the morning building in a borrowed glass bowl. I cleaned until my hands cracked. I wiped down the inside of the cupboard doors, which is insane, but I did it because some part of me was still trying to pass her test. She arrived 40 minutes early to help, which meant she walked through my house running inspections while I plated food, and she said everything looked lovely, and I let myself believe it. Then, halfway through dessert, she tapped her wine glass with a fork. I'll never forget the sound. It cut clean through the room and everybody went quiet the way people do, smiling, expecting a toast. My husband's aunt set down her spoon, and my mother-in-law stood up, dabbed the corner of her mouth with a napkin, and said, "I just want to say something because we all love Owen so much." My stomach dropped before I even knew why. She reached into the leather bag she'd hung on the back of her chair, and she took out a folder, an actual folder, and from it she pulled photographs, printed at a pharmacy on glossy paper, and she started laying them on my dining table next to the trifle. The laundry, the mugs, the toys. A close-up of the smear on a window. "I've been concerned for a while now," she said in the gentlest voice you've ever heard, "about the conditions Owen is being raised in. And I think, as a family, we owe it to him to talk honestly about whether his mother is coping." The room went so silent I could hear the furnace kick on. I watched my husband's face. I watched him not stand up. I watched him do the thing he always did, which was look confused, like the situation was happening to him, like he was a bystander at his own table while his wife was put on trial over the lunch she'd spent 2 days making. His aunt reached over and touched my wrist and whispered, "Honey, are you okay?" and my mother-in-law delivered the line she'd clearly rehearsed, the one she'd been building toward for 18 months of sticky notes and time-stamped photos. Sometimes, she said, love means stepping in when a mother can't cope. That was the moment she tried to take my son. Right there between the ham and the trifle, in front of 14 people, she made her case to the jury she'd assembled. And here's the thing I'm proudest of in this whole story. More than anything that came after, I didn't cry. Every cell in my body wanted to. My throat closed and my eyes burned and my hands shook under the table. But I understood, in a flash of cold clarity, exactly what she wanted. She wanted me to break. She wanted tears, a raised voice, a scene, something she could point to later, something that would prove the very instability she was alleging. See? She's not coping. She'd built a stage and she was waiting for me to perform the role she'd written, so I gave her nothing. I stood up. I said calmly, "Thank you all for coming. I think we'll wrap up lunch now." And I excused myself, walked down the hall to the one finished bathroom, locked the door, sat on the edge of the tub, and let myself shake for exactly 4 minutes by the timer on my phone. Then I splashed my face with cold water, looked at myself in the mirror, and made a decision that changed everything. She wanted to build a case. Fine. I'd build a better one. That night, after the last car pulled out of the driveway, my husband said the words that I think finally killed whatever I'd been protecting. He said, "Maybe Mom has a point. Maybe we have been a bit chaotic." We. As if he'd been there for any of it. As if a single one of those photos was a crime. I didn't argue. Arguing was the old me. Instead, I went into the spare room, opened my laptop, and started a list. The first thing I learned over the next 2 weeks is that you don't beat a person like this with emotion. You beat them with documentation. Because documentation is the only language they understand, and they never expect you to learn it. On the Monday, I drove to the Canadian Tire on Fairview and bought a smart lock for the front door and a video doorbell, the kind with a sticker on the box that says it records, and I installed both myself with a YouTube tutorial and a borrowed drill while Owen napped. I did not hide them. That was deliberate. I mounted that doorbell at eye level where you couldn't miss it. I put a little visible camera in the front hall pointed at the door. I wanted them seen. A hidden camera is a trap. A visible one is a boundary. I was done trapping. I was setting a line and daring her to cross it on the record. I changed the smart lock so the only codes that worked were mine and my husband's. Her physical key now opened nothing. I didn't tell her. I didn't tell him either, which I'll admit was a calculated risk. Then I did the boring, powerful work. I booked Owen a full well baby visit with our family doctor at the clinic on New Street, and I asked her in writing for a note confirming he was healthy, developmentally on track, and being raised in a stable home. And she gave it to me without blinking, because of course she did. Because Owen was a thriving, fat-cheeked, overloved baby, and anyone with eyes could see it. I started a log. Dates, times, exactly what was said, who was present. I'm a designer. Organizing information is literally my job. I made it clean and chronological and undeniable. And I found 2 things in those 2 weeks that turned a defense into a weapon. The first was the mail. I'd noticed for months that envelopes addressed to me sometimes showed up already opened. The flap torn and pressed flat again. Tax stuff. A letter from my bank. Something from my old employer. I'd assumed it got damaged in transit. It hadn't. One afternoon, I came back from the park early and the doorbell camera caught her, on video, standing at my front hall table flipping through my mail, slitting an envelope with her thumbnail, reading it, and putting it back. Opening someone else's mail in this country isn't a quirky overstep. Interfering with the mail is an offense under the Canada Post Corporation Act, and tampering can land you in front of a judge. I didn't know that yet on the day I watched the footage. I knew it by the end of the week because I looked it up, and I printed that out too. The second thing was the worst, and it was the one that ended any sympathy I had left. My husband left his laptop open one evening, signed into the family email account they shared from years back, the one I'd never had a reason to look at. I'm not going to pretend I didn't look. I looked. And in the drafts folder, saved but not sent, there was an email. It was addressed to a family lawyer in Oakville. The subject line said, "Consultation. Concerns re grandson's welfare." It was written by my mother-in-law from the account she shared with her son, and it laid out, in cold, organized paragraphs, a pattern of concern about the child's mother. It referenced documentation. It used the phrase potential referral to the Children's Aid Society. It had her name typed at the bottom. She wasn't venting. She wasn't an overbearing grandma who didn't know her limits. She had been collecting photographs at my house for a year and a half to build a file she could hand to a lawyer and a children's aid worker to take my son away from me. The sticky notes, the Sunday dinner comments, the text to my husband, the public ambush at lunch. None of it was random. It was construction. She was building a structure brick by brick, and I was the thing it was being built on top of. I printed that too. I printed everything. And then I did the one thing she would never in 1,000 years have predicted. I called her, and I invited her over. I made my voice warm. I made it almost tearful. I said I'd been thinking a lot about what she said at lunch, that maybe she was right, that maybe I did need help, and could she come by Thursday morning, just the two of us, so we could talk woman to woman about how she could be more involved. I heard the satisfaction in her pause. I heard her think she'd won. "Of course, dear," she said. "I'm so glad you're finally seeing sense." I also called my husband at his office in the city and asked him, very simply, to come home early on Thursday because there was something about his mother he needed to see with his own eyes, and that if he loved me at all, he would be there at 11 and not 1 minute later. Something in my voice must have been different than every other time I'd asked him for something, because he didn't argue. He just said, "Okay." Thursday morning at 9:02, I watched the doorbell feed on my phone from the kitchen. Her car pulled into the driveway. Snow still banked along the edges from the storm 2 days before. She came up the walk, that confident stride, and she put her key in the front door and turned it. Nothing. I watched her face on the little screen. She tried it again. She jiggled it. The smart lock's keypad glowed at her, useless because her key opened nothing anymore and never would again. And then, only then, she did something she had never once done in 2 years of letting herself into my home. She rang the doorbell. I let it ring twice before I opened the door, and I smiled at her, genuinely, because for the first time since I'd met her, I wasn't afraid. "Oh," I said, "I changed the locks. Smart lock. You know how it is. Safety." Her eyes flicked to the doorbell camera, to the little hall camera behind me, and something in her face went still. She knew. She didn't know what yet, but she knew the ground had moved. I walked her into a kitchen that was spotless, because I'd cleaned it, not for her, but as a kind of joke only I would get. I made tea. Earl Grey in the good cups. And I sat her down at the same table where she'd laid out her photographs, and I slid a folder across to her, my folder, and I said, "I've been documenting things too." She opened it. Owen's clean bill of health. The doctor's letter. My log, neat and dated. And then, because she still hadn't understood the scale of it, I picked up the remote and turned on the television in the next room where I'd already queued up the camera footage. Her at my hall table, her slitting open my mail with her thumbnail and reading it, time-stamped, dated, lit like an exhibit. "That's me opening a letter," she said, and her voice had gone thin. "In my son's house." "It's my house," I said. "And it's federal. Tampering with someone's mail." I looked it up. I let that sit. But that's not the part I wanted you to see. That's when I heard the garage door and my husband's footsteps in the mudroom, stamping snow off his boots, and he came into the kitchen, confused, his tie still on, and found the two of us at the table and the television frozen on a paused image of his mother going through his wife's mail. "Mom?" he said. She recovered fast. I'll give her that. She was a professional. "Elliot, I was checking on things. Any concerned grandmother would. Sloan invited me here to talk, and now she's ambushing me by letting yourself into our home for 2 years?" I said quietly. "By taking pictures of our laundry to build a file?" Elliot, sit down. I want you to see the last thing. And I slid the final page across the table. The printed draft email, the subject line, consultation, concerns Ray, grandson's welfare, the lawyer's name, the phrase referral to the Children's Aid Society, his mother's name at the bottom, sent from the account they shared. I watched my husband read it. I watched his face do the thing it had never done in our entire marriage, which was understand. He read it twice. He looked up at his mother, and he said in a voice I'd never heard from him, flat and frightened, "You were going to call Cass on Sloan. You were going to try to take Owen." "I was protecting my grandson," she whispered. "No," I said. "You were preparing to take a baby away from his mother. There's a difference, and it's the whole difference." She turned to her son, the way she always did, expecting the rescue she'd always gotten. "Elliot, tell her she's being hysterical. Tell her." And he didn't. For 18 months, I had waited for my husband to stand between me and his mother, and he never had, not once, and I'd stopped expecting it. But he stood up now. He put his hand flat on the printed email and he said, "Mom, you went too far." It wasn't loud. It wasn't a grand speech, but it was the first time in his life he chose his wife over the woman who'd raised him, and I felt something in my chest that had been clenched for a year and a half finally let go. I stood up too. My hands weren't shaking this time. I said, "Here's what's going to happen. I've already filed the doorbell footage and a written statement. Your key doesn't work and it never will again. You will not enter this house without an invitation, ever. And there won't be many. If you contact a lawyer or a children's aid worker about my fitness as a mother, I have a folder that proves there was never anything wrong, and I have video of you committing an actual offense in my front hall, and I will not hesitate to use it. I'm not keeping Owen from you. I want him to have a grandmother. But you will earn that back on my terms, in my time, or you won't get it at all." She looked at me like she was seeing a stranger. In a way, she was. The woman she'd been documenting for 18 months didn't exist anymore. "You've turned my son against me," she said. "No," I said. "You did that. I just stopped cleaning up after it." She stood, gathered her coat, her dignity coming apart at the seams, and walked to the front door, the one she could no longer open without me, and waited for me to let her out. I did. I watched her car back down the driveway and turn onto the street and disappear, and then I closed the door, and the deadbolt slid home with a sound I'd never appreciated before. The house was quiet. Owen was asleep upstairs. My husband was still standing in the kitchen holding that page, and when he looked at me, there was something broken open in his face. A year and a half of that's just how she is finally catching up to him. We had a long way to go, the two of us. Trust like that doesn't come back because of one good afternoon. But that's a different story. What I want you to take from this one is smaller and harder. For 18 months, I thought my kindness was my strength, and it wasn't. My silence wasn't peace. It was just permission, handed over one swallowed comment at a time. The day I stopped trying to win her approval and started keeping a record was the day everything changed, and the only thing I'd do differently is start sooner. I stood in my own front hall that afternoon, in the quiet snow ticking against the window, and for the first time in 2 years it felt like the floor under my feet was actually mine. Not cleaner, not tidier, just mine. And nobody was ever going to walk in and tell me otherwise again. For a long time, I told myself that being patient with my mother-in-law was the decent thing to do, and it took me far too long to see that I confused decency with surrender. Decency isn't letting someone walk over you in your own front hall. The day I peeled her sticky notes off my cupboards and threw them out and said nothing, I thought I was keeping the peace. I wasn't. I was teaching her that the rules of my home were hers to write. Every quiet swallow on my part was a small permission slip, and she collected them the same way she collected those time-stamped photos. Patiently, deliberately, building toward the moment at that dinner table when she tried to take Owen from me. What saved me in the end wasn't anger. Anger was what she wanted. She'd built a whole stage hoping I'd give her a scene she could point to. What saved me was sitting on the edge of the bathtub for 4 minutes, letting myself shake, and then deciding to learn the one thing she never expected me to learn. I learned how mail tampering actually works in this country. I learned what a children's aid referral requires. I learned that a visible camera isn't a trap, it's a boundary you dare someone to cross on the record. None of that came from being clever by nature. It came from being willing to sit at my laptop after Owen was asleep and do the unglamorous, careful work of understanding the ground I was standing on. The folder beat her, not the tears. And the hardest part, the part I'm still proud of, was holding steady long enough to use what I'd learned. There were a dozen nights I wanted to scream at Elliot to throw the photos in his face, to burn it all down in one loud evening. If I had, she'd have won, because loud is exactly the picture she was painting of me. Holding my nerve, keeping my voice level when I slid that folder across the table. That wasn't weakness dressed up as patience anymore. It was something with a spine in it. Here's what I'd say to anyone watching their own version of this. Kindness that never has a limit isn't kindness. It's an open door, and the wrong people will always walk through it. You don't protect your family by being agreeable. You protect them by being honest about what's actually happening, by learning the things you'd rather not have to know, and by finding the steadiness to act before someone forces your hand. My mother-in-law spent 18 months convinced my softness was the gap she could climb through. The day I stopped apologizing for taking up space in my own life, the deadbolt finally slid home, and for the first time the floor under my feet was mine.